For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Wits senior researcher Nicola Pons-Vignon and PhD candidate Mbuso Nkosi join me to discuss the book Struggle in a Time of Crisis. Your book is titled Struggle in a Time of Crisis. What crisis are you referring to?
Okay, thank you, Shannon. In terms of the crisis, as you say, the book is titled Struggle in a Time of Crisis. And when we speak of the crisis, so to struggle in a time of crisis, right? So when we speak of the crisis, we speak first, as the introduction shows, we speak of the havoc that has, occurred as a result of the 2007 financial crisis, right? And we see that what it has done, it has put on a number of things on the plate, right? Unemployment, inequality, joblessness, and casualization of labor. And what this crisis again, when we look at the crisis again, we also speak of the crisis in terms of labor, what is happening in the left, the crisis of the left, which can be traced back to, the 1960s in Europe, as Keynesianism was dominating the world, where a number of trade unions had won, I think, hard battles, right, and got co-opted into different structures of business, and they were making a number of decisions, and they were enjoying the spoils of victory. And because of that, right, we say, when the crisis hit, right, it forced labor, organized labor, and different, I think, social forces to rethink what it means again to struggle, because they had enjoyed, I think, the spoils of victory, as I say, where there was state employment, the welfare state, and so this is, I think, the crisis. We do not only focus on the financial aspect of it, we also focus on what the crisis of values. How do we think of alternatives? If we do have alternatives, how are they going to emerge?
Your book offers a strong critique of neoliberalism. One definition of neoliberalism is given as follows: an approach to economics and social studies in which control of economic factors is shifted from the public sector to the private sector. Do you agree with this definition?
Well, when it comes to that definition, I'd say it has to be broadened and it has to be placed within the context. As we say, neoliberalism is not only about policy, but it's also about ideology. And as an ideology, one has to trace it well beyond, I think, not just the 70s, as it began to dominate most corners, when it was starting to dominate most corners of the world, but to also trace it when Keynesian economics was dominating, where a number of thinkers, your Friedman, were also thinking of how then do we speak, I think, to Keynes, they were thinking of speaking against the Keynesian welfare state. So neoliberalism is an ideology that says, in most cases, if left to its own, the market will always produce the optimal outcomes. It emphasizes the idea of the market, but again, as we show, right, this is not to say that the neoliberalism does not need the state. It does need the state, and the crisis has shown that the state intervention is well and alive even during the period of neoliberalism. So if one looks at neoliberalism, it's one that says, if left on its own, if the state does not intervene, allows for the private sector to dominate, then everyone in society would be happy. But of course, then we have seen this idea in terms of policy in education, healthcare, and the labor market, where it says do not intervene in that case. And
Nicola, you state that an alternative which is steadily rising across Europe is a far-right populism. However, you state that this is reminiscent of the 1930s. Why is this worrying?
Well, obviously the rise and accession to power of the Nazis in Germany or the fascists in Italy was a key element that led us to the Second World War. And obviously I think it's quite clear in hindsight that the kinds of policy packages that they were proposing were certainly not good for growth or for human societies in the long term. But what I think is reminiscent of the 1930s today, although in some ways today is worse than the 1930s, is that it is these far-right parties that seem to be the main ones that are talking to the majority. The majority of people who either have lost a job or have lost income or are losing access to subsidized housing, transport or healthcare. who feel frustrated. But as I was saying, the mainstream left parties in power or in the mainstream opposition often cannot really respond to the preoccupations of these people. Now, there's two possibilities in an alternative. Either you have a coherent, progressive alternative that people can go with, that they feel is politically viable, and that it speaks a different language to that of neoliberalism, but without relying, for example, on division to try and win. Or you have what is the easiest solution, which is often a lot less progressive than it may appear to be, which is populism. People who try to speak to the people, but who do so, for example, the Nazis, the National Socialists. I mean, they were clearly trying to speak to the German population that was very impoverished following the defeat in World War I, but also the huge reparations that the French and the British demanded from the Germans. So they had a fertile terrain, as South Africa does today, a fertile terrain to say, look, the Jews are guilty, are the ones who are behind your problems. Today in South Africa, it could be the foreigners are the ones who are behind your problem, or whatever group we may want to choose and decide to victimize. And now obviously that is very worrying, because I don't think we can believe that an alternative that is founded on exclusion, on violence, and on victimizing other victims ultimately of an exploitative system is what's going to get us out of the crisis. On the contrary, I think a progressive alternative would be to think in terms of classes, because that's actually the most inclusive way we have to think in terms of who's benefiting and who's losing. So an alternative founded on a class analysis, I think, is exactly what neoliberalism has tried to conceal from us. This idea that a certain kind of policies of so-called liberalization, would actually benefit everybody. And what we've seen is the opposite, that these policies have actually served the interest of often very concentrated large-scale capital, and really been detrimental to the manufacturing sector, certainly to workers, and to any kinds of attempts at making societies more equal. So reclaiming a space where we can talk about alternatives in a way that incorporates a class understanding of the implications of policies, but without, of course, meaning that we're not talking here about killing the 1%, or however we define the dominant classes, but acknowledging that what we are faced with is a very, very organized political, economic, media controlled society, and that to fight this discourse we need unity across the board, which is something the left has historically struggled with, but that initiatives that the Global Labour column try to contribute to addressing by promoting unity and showing how very similar problems are occurring across the world, and call for similar solutions.
Many economists argue that neoliberal capitalism does not only increase inequality, but generates disequilibria, which threaten the possibility of sustained growth. What is your view?
Well, I think that's exactly where we are today. The crisis that started in 2007 has been often described as a crisis associated with the consequences of neoliberal policies. These policies were sold, quote unquote, as policies that would resolve the problems with too much state intervention and an inefficient allocation of factors of production. But the result has been that the first one we know, which is very, very clear, is a return to incredibly high levels of inequality. I think it was in 2007 or 2008 that the US got back to the level it was at prior to 1929, of an enormous share of total income appropriated by the top 1%. But a lot of economists said, well, that's fine, because inequality can actually sustain growth. It doesn't matter. What matters is growth rates. Now, the crisis has shown that not only does neoliberalism increase inequality, and its particular inequality between capital and labor, as shown by Thomas Piketty, for example, but it also makes the whole foundation of growth fragile, because a very uneven distribution of income is actually not something that is good for the demand that the economy needs to keep going. It also, of course, increases situations of extreme poverty, which are themselves also, of course, harmful. So the problem with the current policy package that is globally dominant is not just that it's increasing inequality, but it's also that it's not sustainable in terms of growth. And I think it's it's where we are today to see that the only solutions that economists and policymakers can offer to a crisis linked to neoliberal policies is more neoliberal policies. And I think the problem with that is that whether we're in South Africa thinking of the ANC, or of course in Britain thinking of New Labour, or in Germany with the SPD, is that the left-wing parties across the board have espoused neoliberalism. So they may differ on, say, gay marriage or the level of social grants, but they do not have any differences when it comes to thinking about macroeconomic policy. So today, for example, what we need very clearly is a lot more investment to get the economic machine going, whether it's in Greece or in South Africa or elsewhere. And yet, neoliberal stronghold on our thinking on the macroeconomy and the policies prevents us from going there, because people are afraid of debt. And I think that's a major problem, because if the mainstream parties do not offer any substantive difference, then it could open the door to various problems.
What impact is this crisis having on labour, and what alternatives are there to the neoliberal crisis?
The impact on labour, and I'd start with the impact on labour and also speak to the alternatives. And perhaps I'd also bring it closer to us, South Africa, to say what we see. Well, as I've mentioned, we saw unemployment, we saw the rise of casualization. Casualization is always linked to the idea of labour market flexibility, where a number of people have been working a lot of hours with a little pay, or sometimes they're occupying precarious jobs. That is when it is applied to labour. But I think what we saw, and I think when we think of it when it is applied to labour here in South Africa, as we saw with the Marikana massacre, as we saw with the farm workers' strike in Didorns in 2007. This is all rooted in neoliberalism and its effects, because then if you come to think of it, well, as the book shows, the article on Marikana, that a number of unions had been co-opted into decision-making when it came to business, and of course the story of Noom has been retold in a number of articles, that Noom had lost its alliance with the workers, hence they went to armed coup. And of course, if you look at the workers themselves, they were facing a number of issues. One of them is that of debt, right? Microloans, and the microloans giving workers that money because the wage was not enough, right, to meet their reproduction. And because of that, right, we saw the strike. And of course, then in the Dons, it also happened in 2012, and we saw the massacre. So that's been its application in terms of labor. But in terms of alternatives, and I think of alternatives, as I've been saying, neoliberalism is also an ideology. So there is then a need to explore ideas, right? During the crisis, the world has been saying more neoliberalism. And one of the articles, when we look at Europe in turmoil, in Europe there's also been a fortification of neoliberalism during the crisis. So what we say is that, I think the article by Joan Falicio in the book, and I also believe in this, to say, well, as much as one needs alternative policies to neoliberalism, there's also then a need for a dialogue of within progressive forces to think critically and differently, to say how then do we push different ideas, right? But of course then there is then that need of strong social forces that are interested in these ideas, policy ideas, ideas that seek to say, what do we, it might sound melancholic, right? One might say we are engaging in melancholia, but what is a world that does not have utopia? So we also need to also think of ideas that extend far beyond the current. So the current, we might think of the current, but we also need to debate what the future holds for us. So this is when labor stretches far beyond the question of just organizing, and also looking at social movements, how social movements have been fighting different struggles in South Africa, and how it links up with those struggles. And as we show in the book, right, the article by Karl Kluti from NUMSA, where he tries to show that NUMSA has been thinking as to how, right, it challenges the current state of affairs where the ruling party has also been seduced by a number of neoliberal policies. And it says, clearly it's not just about looking at union matters, it's also about extending to focusing on social movements. So hence then it says they are steaming ahead. But steaming ahead would also mean, and as we try in the global labor union, in the global labor column, the global labor column is to start a conversation that allows, well, not to say we are just going to change the world, but to contribute to the ideas that are just going to change the world and bring about an alternative. So the alternative is one that is going to be one within struggles, debate about alternative policies, and yeah, that's, I think, how the alternative would emerge. It's not just something that just emerges and we say, bingo, we have the right policies. But as you would see, even guys like Friedman were also debating ideas. As today we have neoliberalism, it emerged from hard-fought struggles during the period of Keynesianism. So today, the floor is open for us to fight hard for alternative ideas and debate amongst ourselves as to which society we want to live in. So this society would speak to a question of inequality, unemployment, labor market flexibility, education, healthcare, yeah.
That was Wits senior researcher Pons-Vignon and PhD candidate Mbuso Nkosi speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the book Struggle in a Time of Crisis.